So this morning we're continuing looking at the fruit of the Spirit, and today we're up to patience. And if you're anything like me, you got to this one and you sort of went, So just quickly we'll go over our memory verse for the series, which is Galatians 5:22 to 23, which is, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control." The reason why I sort of groaned when I got to patience is because of the fruit, it's probably one of the ones that's the hardest to grow. Growing patience can take a lot of patience. But it's also the easiest to lose. It's quite common that you'll hear people say, they lost their patience. They were doing okay, but they lost their patience. It also tends to be something that people notice when you lose. People will point it out. If you have it, people will notice it as well. You'll hear people say of someone, they're a very patient person. They can put up with a lot. But if they don't have it, they tend to say, you're doing this for that person, you better get it to them quickly because they're not very patient. They'll get upset with you if you don't get it to them quickly. For the world, patience tends to be something that you either have or you don't. It's quite common that you'll hear people say, especially when they're in couples, I'm not the patient one, they're patient, so I don't need to be. It's considered a trait that you either possess or a trait that you don't. But as Christians, we're called to grow the fruit of the Spirit, so it's something that we should all have. The patience that is the result of the working of the Spirit in our lives, it grows and matures with time. So it's something that will grow in you, that will just develop. One day you'll be in a situation and you'll look at it and you go, hang on a minute, about a year, 2 years ago, if I was in this situation, I would have been pretty impatient. I would have been pretty annoyed. And it's just something that happens. Like all the fruit, it is an attribute of the Father. All the fruit point to God. So patience is no different. We find that God declared who he was to Moses in Israel, patience formed part of his identity. So it's not only an attribute of God, it's something that he identifies as part of his identity. In Exodus 34:5 and 6, the Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name of the Lord. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, patient, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. When God declared who he was to Moses in Israel, patience was part of his name. When he did this was quite extraordinary too, because Moses had just got his second lot of tablets from God. He destroyed the first lot, destroying the golden calf. Israel had rebelled already. He'd only just taken them out of Egypt, and all the miracles that they saw to get them there, and they rebelled so quickly, yet God was patient with them. And he said to them when he spoke to them, I am patient. He had every reason then to wipe them out. He could have, and if it wasn't for Moses, he probably would have. But he showed patience with his people, and this wasn't the first time that he showed this. Really early on in Genesis, we see the story of Noah, and 1 Peter 3:20 says, because they formerly did not obey when God's patience waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. Patience is an attribute of God. Even when he had decided to flood the world and wipe out mankind, he waited. As Noah built the ark, he waited. All this time, he would have had people trying to stir people up to come and join. As the animals gathered and housed in the ark, these signs that the people would have seen, you can't ignore a whopping great big boat. You can't ignore the fact that animals are just showing up and going into it. He gave them every opportunity to be saved. It was only at the last possible moment that God closed the door. Up until that point, he was patient with all the people, and anyone who had have run up and gone in through that door would have been saved. It was the last possible moment. Paul himself held himself up as an example of God's patience. And he writes to Timothy in 1 Timothy 1:16, and he says, "But I receive mercy for this reason, that in me, as the foremost, Jesus Christ might display his perfect patience as an example to those who believe in him for eternal life." Paul's saying to Timothy, he's saying, look at me. Look at who I was. Look at what I was doing. Yet God had patience with me. He could have punished him. He could have just snuffed out his life. He could have just saved the Christians around and let Paul go on the way he was, but he didn't. He met him and he saved him. Even though Paul himself probably would have felt that he was beyond saving, God saved him. And that's one of the reasons I believe that Paul has such an appreciation for grace and writes about it so much, is because he experienced the fullness of grace firsthand in a way that he felt he didn't deserve. Paul understood that God is love. 1 John 4:8 says, "Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love." And he wrote to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 13:4, "Love is patient, love is kind." If God is love and love is patient, then God is patient. Paul's saying that we need that patience, that God is patient. He's patient with us. So that is something that we should strive for as well. The fruit of patience grows and ripens when we are completely reliant on the Father. It's very easy to be patient when everything's going well. Very easy to be patient when everything is going well. We have time, we're not under stress, so patience just sort of comes naturally. But when we are fully reliant on the Father, especially in times of struggle, then that is when patience really starts to grow, because it's something that we need to just keep pushing in to him for. It creates a complete reliance on God when we stop and wait on him. When we just stop and wait, which sometimes is hard because we want to do things. We want to get through whatever we're doing. We need to let him work in the situation. We need to let him provide. And it's when we do those things that our patience grows. It allows him also to renew us and to strengthen us. Patience is fundamentally important to our renewal. Isaiah 40:31 says, "But they who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint." When we wait on the Lord, when we are patient, he is able to work in us. He's to prepare us for things that we could never do in our own strength. Throughout the Bible, there's a number of examples of people who have waited on the Lord and been patient, and they've grown their reliance, and we've seen great things from them. But today, I want to look at one, and it's probably a little bit different to the way this story's been looked at before, because I'm not going to look at essentially what happened, but what happened in between, if that makes sense, which hopefully it will by the end. So if you're following along and you've got your Bible, just turn to 1 Kings 17. And this is, of course, the story of Elijah. Verse 17 starts with, "Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, 'As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word.' And the word of the Lord came to him, 'Depart from here and turn eastward, and hide yourself by the brook of Cherith, which is east of the Jordan. You shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there.'" We're introduced to Elijah with a gutsy move. He's walked to the king and he said to him, No more rain, no more dew. You're going to go into drought. And this was quite a big thing because Ahab had brought Baal worship to a new level with Israel. And Baal was the god of fertility and rain. So this wasn't just saying to the people of Israel, it's just not going to rain. This was a direct challenge of the god that they were holding up over God. Baal was interesting because sometimes he would have to submit to Mot, the god of death, and that he would go away. And that was when they would have a dry season. But he always came back, and that would be their wet season. But what Elijah was saying was, I have a God who can live and stop the rain and start the rain, and he's better than your God. So this was a huge challenge that Elijah put forward. More than that, he said that it would not be lifted until he said it would. So he was God's conduit. So God was obviously telling him it was God that would make it rain again. But Elijah was clear. It was when Elijah would tell him the rain would come, that the rain would come. That put him in a very perilous situation because in Ahab's mind, he knew what he needed to do. He needed to get Elijah to say it'll rain again and the rain would come back. Knowing this, God almost immediately says to him, run. I've set something up for you. Run. Get out of there. You're not safe. Not only did he have to flee, but he had to hide himself. And in other versions of the Bible, the brook of Cherith is in a ravine. So it would have been hidden away. Quite possibly the entrance would have been of such that you could walk past it and not realise it was even there. Verse 5. So he went and did according to the word of the Lord, and he lived by the brook of Cherith that was in the east of Jordan. This would have called for great patience from Elijah. He couldn't leave that ravine for fear of being found by the king. As I said, only his word could break the drought. We learn later in 1 Kings 18 that Ahab had sent people looking for Elijah. He was actively looking for him to bring him back so he could have that drought broken. So Elijah had to stay put. He was in this place and he couldn't move. He had just enough waters to sustain him. This brook wouldn't have been free-flowing and flowing out into great amounts because if it had been, people would have known it was there. They would have been able to find it. So they would have come looking for him and he would have been found. His food was brought to him by ravens. He got meat and bread in the morning and meat and bread in the evening, all brought to him by ravens. Because people would have been noticed. If there was people constantly 2 times a day going and walking that way, they would have been spotted. But birds wouldn't have gone unnoticed. In verse 6, and the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. Every day, Elijah waited on God. Every day he waited on God in patience. Every day, God reminded him of his provision because he was supplying him with food and water. Every day, he was reminded of God's protection because he was safe. No one had found him. What Elijah would have learnt during that time is that he was held in the palm of God's hand in full protection and full provision. In that time of patience and waiting, God was reinforcing on Elijah that he was there for him, that he could trust him, that he could rely on him. It must have been an amazing time of relationship building between Elijah and God because he was there on his own. He would have been communing with God daily, praying to him daily. He would have been thanking him for his provision. He would have been thanking him for his protection. He would have been praying over what's to come next, Lord. Start sharing your vision with me. He would have been, by the time he left there, full of confidence and reliance on the Father, which he was going to need because it says soon his water ran out and he was going to have to trust God once again and move. In verse 7 it says, and after a while the brook dried up because there was no rain in the land. And when the Lord came to him, and then the word of the Lord came to him, go once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon, and stay there. I have directed a widow to supply you with food." And Elijah went. We've seen other examples in the Bible where God's given people an instruction and they've gone, "Are you sure? Do you want me to do that, really?" Or, "Not me, Lord, certainly not me." Gideon tested him multiple times before he did what God came to him, but not Elijah. Elijah just went. And that's because he'd spent that time waiting on the Lord. He was building that relationship. So when God spoke to him and says, "I'm going to provide for you, but I'm doing it over here now," there wasn't doubt because God already had. So why wouldn't he? So he would just up and went. God directs him not back to the king to break the drought. He doesn't direct him to a foreign court, which would have been befitting of a prophet of God. He could have sent him down into Judah and he could have stayed there. But no, God sends him to a widow and she will feed him, God tells him. He knows nothing of this person or her situation at this point, only that God has said, "Go and I will provide." Elijah doesn't doubt, he doesn't question, he goes. What we learn about the widow as you read on is that she is so destitute herself. She is so low on food, the drought is affecting them as well, that she is about to bake her last loaf of bread with what's left of her flour and what's left of her oil, feed it to herself and her son, and then wait to die. That's pretty a hard situation. I can't imagine being in such a situation that I have to prepare a final meal for my family and then just wait. But this was the situation that this widow was in when Elijah came and says to her, "God said that you will feed me." "I don't have enough," she says. "I'm about to bake my last meal." So Elijah says, "Well, bake me something first and then bake what's left for your family." In 1 Kings 17, 13 to 16, Elijah said to her, "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first, make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. And then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord God of Israel says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jar of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." She went away and did as Elijah told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family, for the jar of flour was not used up, and the jar of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. By this point, Elijah just knew that God was going to do this. He knew he would provide. Why wouldn't he? He's kept him alive with ravens in a ravine for who knows how long. Why wouldn't he supply his food here in this place where he's been sent? In his patience, in his waiting, he had learnt to trust the Lord above all else. Proverbs 3, 5 to 6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding." That must have been playing in Elijah at that time because from his understanding that was done. There's no food here. But he didn't lean on his own understanding. "In all ways submit to him and he will make your paths straight." This, of course, doesn't mean that our paths will be literally straight. That's not the way God works. What it means is that when we are submitted to him and when we rely on him and we wait on him, we learn to hear his voice. We trust in his direction. A windy path can feel straight when you're following the Lord because you're following his directions. Rod mentioned last week that sometimes we're waiting for God to move the mountain when God wants us to take the path to the side. It's in times of patience and in times of waiting that we hear God give these instructions. If we're always busy, if we've always got our heads full and we're not taking that moment to step back, wait on the Lord and be patient, then we risk missing his direction for us in our life. when we build that trust in the Lord, when we build that reliance in the Lord, he's able to do great things through us. We see this put into action when the widow's son dies and Elijah cries out to God to restore him. We pick up at verse 20. And then he cried out to the Lord, "Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die?" And then he stretched himself out on the boy 3 times and cried out to the Lord, "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." And the Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. Elijah picked up the child and carried him from the room into the house. He gave him to his mother and said, "Look, your son is alive." Then the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." That was something only God could do. But Elijah didn't hesitate. When he heard about the son's death, he picked her up. He carried her upstairs into his room. He laid her down and he cried out to the Lord to restore his life. It was beyond Elijah's ability to do. He needed to trust in the Lord. And why wouldn't he? He had stopped the rain. He provided for Elijah in the ravine. He'd spent a considerable period of time getting to know the Lord and just waiting on him, patiently trusting. So why wouldn't God? God had used his time with Elijah to draw him in closer to him, to build a strong relationship, building the foundations of what God intended for Elijah. God does the same with us. In our moments of waiting, in our moments of patience, as we wait on God, that is when he builds us. That is when he's able to strengthen us and renew us, trusting on him to provide our needs. Our needs might be different from what Elijah's were, but we still need food. And sometimes we need to trust that God's going to provide that. We need to pay our bills. Anyone who's ever had any type of bill knows that sometimes you've got to trust the Lord for provision to pay their bill. It could be in your ministry. You need to trust the Lord will provide your needs for your ministry, because we all have a ministry, and at times we just need God to intercede in that. Trusting that he is there for us and he loves us. It's in those times of patience that we learn that. God was preparing and building up Elijah as he waited. He took that time in the ravine to build him, to get him ready. He then moved him somewhere else so he could see in action the provision and everything. He saw that he would still provide by keeping the jar of oil and flour full. He then showed Elijah what he was capable of by raising the son to life. And he needed that. As we said before in Isaiah 40:31, "But they who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength." Wait on the Lord to renew your strength. "And they shall mount up with wings like eagles." Eagles in that day would have been the thing that flew the highest. So you're being lifted up to the highest. If Isaiah was writing this today, he would probably say raised up like winds like a jumbo jet, because they get a lot higher. It's saying that we're being lifted up, that we're being carried up because we've waited on the Lord for our strength. They shall run and not be weary. You're able to keep going. It gives you endurance to sustain you through everything you're going through. You shall walk and not faint. Without this time of complete reliance on God, it is possible that Elijah wouldn't have been able to stand firm and represent God on Mount Carmel. God was building Elijah, getting him ready for his time, for one of possibly the greatest of the miracles that God does in the Old Testament. He could with confidence walk up that hill knowing that God would work. There wouldn't have been any doubt in his mind. He knew what was going to happen. God had spoken with him. He told him God had his back. He knew that as he walked up that mountain. He was so confident that when the Baal prophets couldn't get a response from their God, he mocked them. He was grossly outnumbered, yet he mocked them. 1 Kings 18, 27 to 28, and I've taken this from the Message because I like the wording that they used. By noon, Elijah had started making fun of them, taunting them. Call a little louder. Is he a god after all? Maybe he's off meditating somewhere or other, or maybe he's got it involved in a project, or maybe he's on vacation. You don't suppose he's overslept, do you, and needs to be woken up? Imagine being a prophet and your God, and there's someone here taunting you. You're calling down on him. You've been doing it for hours, and here's this guy saying he's off somewhere else. They pray louder and louder, cutting themselves with swords and knife, a ritual common to them, until they were covered with blood. His relationship was so strong that he knew God would answer when he called upon him. He just knew. Why wouldn't he? So much so that he made his act impossible for man. We learn that he reset the altar. He set his offering upon it, and then he dug a trench around it, and they poured so much water on it that it wet the entire altar and offering and filled the trench. There is no way that man could have lit that fire without first drying it all out. Anyone who's ever tried to light a fire with wet wood knows that it's next to impossible. And that's even if you've got dry stuff in there to help get it started. And then he said in 1 Kings 18, 37 to 38, "Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back." No hesitation. Elijah knew God would answer. And then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust and licked up the water in the trench. A complete and utter act of God that in no way man could have been involved in. Elijah knew God would respond because he'd spent that time in patience and relationship with him. Why wouldn't he? Paul included patience as one of the fruit of the Spirit because in times of patience and in times of waiting on the Lord, he can equip and strengthen us. It focuses us on him because we're forced to step back and wait. We're not busy. We're not trying to solve the problem ourselves. We're not trying to figure out whatever it is ourselves. Even if there isn't a problem, we're not trying to think of the next thing. We're just back and we wait and we put our focus on the Lord. And when we do that, he's able to strengthen and renew us. Most importantly, it builds up reliance in our lives for him. It's all about relationship. It's all about relationship. If you've listened to my other messages on the fruit of the Spirit, you'll see that relationship runs strongly through them because the only way to grow the fruit of the Spirit is to have a relationship with the Father. If you've listened to the other messages that have been, that Rod's been sharing and Rod Draper's been sharing, they're all about relationship because it's when we're in relationship with him, we can hear his voice. It's when we're in relationship with him, we learn to trust him. When we're in relationship with him, we know him. Patience is an attribute of the Father, and when we're in relationship with him, we learn that. I know personally for myself, when I'm in relationship with the Lord and I'm spending my time cultivating that, waiting on him, spending time in patience with him, when the Lord speaks to me, I know it's him. When he says to me, I've got a word for someone, I know it's God speaking. If he says that he wants me to wait or go here, I know it's God speaking. It's only in those times where I'm not investing in that relationship that I hesitate and I wait and I think, is that you, God? Should I be doing that or not? When we're in relationship with him, we learn his voice, we trust him, we know him, and we're able to really empower ourselves, or him empower us, to work for him in a way that we never could on our own.